Happy generic time of the day, product people. Alan Neal here for another quick PDM show CarCast at the PDM show on Facebook and Twitter, pdm.show on the web. I want to talk in this CarCast about the ABCs of Scrum Product Ownership. You'll notice that I didn't say the ABCs of Agile Product Ownership, because if I did that, my good friend Saeed would give me a slap, because he would say, Alan, product owner is a Scrum role. It's not an Agile role. So I want to talk about the ABCs of Scrum Product Ownership. And my inspiration for this is really one of my favorite scenes from one of my favorite movies. If you've got any interest in sales and understanding the thinking of the sales function and how they used to do it in the old days, you definitely want to check out one of my favorite movies, which is called Glengarry Glen Ross. Stars a huge cast. Alec Baldwin is the guy that I'm talking about here, but great movie. Started out as a play by David Mamet. It's called Glengarry Glen Ross. But anyways, the scene in that movie is Alec Baldwin comes in and he's basically trying to coach and motivate a bunch of real estate salespeople. And he walks up to the chalkboard and he writes on the chalkboard ABC. And he says that the ABC for the sales guys that they have to keep in mind is A, always, B, C, closing. So always be closing. Always be closing is what he says, and he's pounding that into their heads. And I thought, in my product ownership work, that there's a good ABCs for Scrum Product Ownership as well. And that would be always be chunking, slicing, and splitting. So always be chunking, slicing, and splitting. And this is important, especially for some of us folks who have maybe come to product ownership from product management, where chunking, slicing, and splitting wasn't quite as important, because we would define features, we would define priorities, and we would largely let our development organization most of the time figure out how to chunk that up and how to deliver that. But when you're in the product owner role, your team is looking for you to not only provide the prioritized features, but they also need you to package those up, to chunk them, to slice them, and to split them into pieces that can be scheduled nicely into the sprints, whatever your sprint length is. And you can typically find out how big those chunks, slices, and splits need to be based on your estimation, whether it's by story points or hours, and obviously your historical velocity for your team. So you always want to be chunking, slicing, and splitting. And there's some good common techniques that have been developed over the years that you can certainly find on Google and certainly find at the Scrum Alliance and things like that. When I was in my certified Scrum Product Owner training, we spent about 2.5 hours on that, and there's some good techniques. I want to comment here a little bit, on what to do if you're in a situation. Most of my experience is in B2B type systems. So what if you're in a situation where you're working with more of a back office type application, more of a business intelligence, data warehousing type application, where what if your end users aren't really using a user interface? What if they're using a set of your APIs, or what if they're using some data that you're providing in a data mart or what have you, because the chunking can be a little more abstract in how to do that. When I was a software developer, we used to do chunking and slicing, but we would do it horizontally in terms of the layers of an application. So we would look at the user interface, certainly. We would look at the business model and objects and rules and things like that. And then we would look at the persistence or storage layer and do database design and things like that. Now, fast forward into the Scrum world, and that is the exact opposite of the way that you typically want to deliver, because the idea with Scrum is to deliver a potentially shippable, i.e. potentially valuable to be used by your stakeholders every iteration. So if you do a database layer, that's not necessarily going to be directly usable by your stakeholders. So if you're in a situation where you're doing more of a back office application, you're doing a set of APIs, you're doing a data warehouse, there's still logical ways that you can think about to chunk, slice and split your application. And I'll give you a couple of ideas here. So let's say you're in a data warehousing scenario. You've been given a source system. Let's say it's a Salesforce type CRM system, a case management system for customer support, a call center system, and you've been basically given an extract or a dump of data, of case data, and what you're trying to do is produce management reports, a data warehouse that can be used for producing management reports. So you're not responsible for actually producing the end reports yourself. What you're responsible for is extracting the data, transforming it, and loading it into a data warehouse that then the lines of business can point their analytics tools and do their own reporting. So how would you go about chunking, slicing and splitting in that case? Well, what I would suggest is even in that scenario, you always want to look at as your primary chunking vehicle, or your primary chunking criteria is, what are the priorities of the business? What are the goals that the business is trying to achieve? And try to understand for your customer what their customer's priorities are. So you might find, for example, if you're looking at the Salesforce, case management, call center, system data, you might find, for example, that their priorities are really, they want to understand where time is being spent in solving customers' problems. And maybe, a typical customer problem will go through a sequence of activities. Maybe the customer initially reports the problem. Maybe the call center has to do some initial investigation. Maybe the call center has to hand that off to a specialist group, whether it's IT or a line of business group, and they have to do some investigation. And then that has to be communicated back to the call center group. Maybe they have to confirm or validate that, and then they get back to the customer. So maybe you've got a process like that. And maybe your customer's customer wants to understand where is the time being spent, typically in customer calls. Now, to tackle all of that at once is likely going to be bigger than you can do in an individual sprint or iteration. So that gives you a chunk, but it's still probably too big of a chunk to tackle within a single iteration. So now is where we get to a slice. So now for a slice, we're looking vertically here. So the exact opposite of the horizontal layers I was talking about earlier. Now we're looking at a vertical slice. So now what we're going to do is we'll say, listen, we're going to take a vertical slice whereby we're not going to look at gathering those start and stop points, right? The durations for each of those, let's say, average 5 activities that happen in a case. For all cases, the slice that we're going to take is maybe one type of case. One common scenario is people, bank customers calling into the bank call center with account opening difficulties. So that's the slice that we're going to take. The slice we're going to take is account opening, and we're going to look at our data feed from our CRM system, from our call center system, and we're going to just look at the data transformations that we need to do to be able to tease out the date and timestamp data for each of the steps that the call center reps go through for solving account opening problems. Okay, and that's going to give us our slice. Now we may, there's good chance and good reason that we may want to go one level further with that, and that's why we have the second S, which is for the first S is slice, the second S is split. So now what we want to do is now we can maybe look at splitting that slice of looking at just account opening data. And now, for example, what we might want to do is we might first just want to say, listen, we're going to start not with all of the steps. We're going to start with splitting that up, and we're just going to do a very coarse grain. So we're going to just capture the total time for the entire case. So when it was opened and when it was closed, and we're going to ignore the individual steps in between, the handoffs, all of that. So that's a good way to split. So we've taken this big thorny hairball of a data extract from our CRM system, and we've chunked it, right, by saying that we're just going to look at account opening, and we're just going to look at the time. The timestamp data to look at how long it takes to do each step of the process. And then we've further split that into saying, rather than looking at each and every step within that process, we're just going to look at the end-to-end time. So how long does it take to close that case from the initial time it's reported to the time that it's closed? And that shows how you can go from a big hairball of a domain, like I've got all this CRM data, down to a chunk, a slice, and then splitting that up even further. And then you've got a basis and a model by which you can iterate, because then you can decide for your next sprint, okay, am I now going to look at blowing out the individual steps within that process? Now am I going to do the same thing, maybe for a different case type? Maybe instead of account opening, maybe it's going to be card expiry, or a damaged card, or some other type of case, a challenged transaction. But it gives you an idea of how you can break that down when you've got a situation where you don't really have a user interface, you don't really have a end user experience that you can work with. So I hope that helps. This has been Alan Neal for the PDM Show, at the PDM Show on Facebook and Twitter, pdm.show on the web, and love to hear your comments. If you're a Scrum product owner, love to hear how you chunk, slice, and split your work and your user stories for your dev team. Talk to you on the next one.